I still dream it. The same pale arm, too long, and 2 points of light flaring back like something caught in a headlight. I'm the only one of 4 who walked out of those woods. Hunter. Barrow Ridge, Hollow County. The same trip we'd made every November for a decade. It's been 4 years. I moved 2 hours south, changed the subject every time it came up, and I'm done being the only one who knows how it actually went. So here it is, in order. If you're listening in the dark right now, stay there. It won't change how this goes. It didn't change how it went for me. But there's something about telling this to someone who's still awake at the same hour it happened. There were 4 of us, me, Danny, Marcus, and Marcus's cousin Pete. Same trip, same 3 days on Barrow Ridge, except the radio had a storm stalled over the ridge for 2 days running, and we went anyway. None of us really knew Pete. He was just out of a bad divorce, needing something to do with a long weekend that wasn't sitting in an apartment above a laundromat. Barrow Ridge was the stretch of woods on the east side of Hollow County the county never bothered to turn into a state park. Because there's nothing up there anybody wants except deer season access. No cell service past the 2nd mile marker, no cabins, just the old Briar Fork logging road, gone to footpath past the first gate, and a campsite by the creek that Danny's dad used to take him to. Danny checked the forecast Thursday night and said it'd blow through by Saturday afternoon. More rain than wind, nothing anybody was calling dangerous. We'd already paid for the truck rental, and Pete had already driven 6 hours to be there. I don't remember every hour of the first day because it was a normal hunting trip. We hiked in, we set up camp near the creek bend. Marcus missed a shot on a doe and wouldn't shut up about it. Pete turned out to be funnier than any of us expected. By the second beer, he had us laughing so hard Danny walked off into the trees so he wouldn't wake up every animal in a mile radius. It was a good day. Everything after it makes that easy to forget. There's one thing from that first afternoon I didn't think about again until much later. While we were setting up the tarp, Danny mentioned, almost as a joke, that his dad had a rule about this campsite. You didn't stay past the second creek crossing if there'd been more than a day of rain on the ridge, and you especially didn't stay if the rain came on fast after a dry stretch, which was exactly the kind of week we'd had. Marcus asked why. It would have made sense as flash flood caution, the kind of practical old-timer rule you hear all over farm country. Danny said his dad never gave a why, just a rule, passed down the way rules get passed down in families that have been somewhere long enough to stop asking questions about them. Pete said something about how every small town's got one weird superstition about its woods. The rain came in around 4 the next afternoon, earlier and harder than the forecast said. The sky just gave up holding on to it all at once. We sat under the tarp we'd strung between 2 trees and ate cold beans out of the can. We figured we'd wait it out, and for about an hour, that's exactly what it was. Waiting. Then the deer came through. There were a lot of them. They were running. They were running the same direction, which I'd never seen deer do before. Usually, if you spook one, they scatter every which way, because that's what makes them hard to hunt. These didn't scatter. 20 of them, maybe more, moving through our camp like we weren't there. Like the tarp and the fire pit and the 4 of us standing up out of our chairs didn't register at all. Pete asked what would do that. Marcus said maybe a bear, working the ridge before the rain really settled in. Danny didn't say anything. I noticed that even then, because Danny always had a theory for everything. The rain kept coming. By full dark, it wasn't rain anymore, so much as a wall of water. The creek that had been maybe 8 feet across that morning had come up over its bank and was starting to lap at the low corner of our camp. We made the call to move, pack up, get back to the Briar Fork Road, get to the truck the better part of 4.5 miles out, rather than risk the water rising more overnight. We slung our rifles and left the rest. Packs, coolers, half the tarp still staked to the ground, because none of it was worth the time it'd cost us. In hindsight, I think it was the wrong call. I've gone over it more times than I can count, and I keep landing in the same place. If we'd stayed put, soaked and miserable with the creek climbing the tent stakes, all 4 of us walk out of those woods a day later with nothing worse than wet boots and a story about the flood that almost got us. Moving is what put us on that trail, in the dark, in its way. I was the one who said we should go. Nobody argued with me. I've had 4 years to wish somebody had. We got maybe half a mile before Danny said he heard something. He didn't say he saw something, he said he heard something. Off to our left, moving parallel to us through the trees. Not toward us, not away, just keeping pace. The way you'd walk alongside someone on a sidewalk without meaning to. We stopped. We listened. For a while there was nothing but rain hitting leaves, which is its own kind of loud. I remember thinking that if something really was out there, it would have been swallowed up by the noise anyway. So what was the point of listening? Then it stopped raining on our left. Not the whole forest, just that patch, a section maybe 30 feet wide, like something big enough to block it was standing there. I know how that sounds, I'm telling you anyway. Marcus had the only working flashlight with any real range on it, a big mag light his dad left him. He swept it across that patch of trees. There was nothing there. No eyes catching the light, no shape. Nothing but wet bark and ferns flattened by rain. But the dry patch was still there. You could see the line of it, dry ground going wet, like the edge of a shadow, except there was no moon and no light source to cast one. Pete said we should keep moving. I've never agreed with anybody more in my life. We picked up the pace. Whatever had been pacing us kept pacing us. I stopped trying to convince myself it wasn't there, because at a certain point the rustling in the brush stops sounding incidental and starts sounding deliberate, steady, unhurried. The sound of something that isn't worried about losing you. We didn't run. People ask me why not, like it's the obvious thing to have done. None of us could see more than 15 feet in front of us. Running blind through unfamiliar woods at night, in a storm, gets you a broken ankle 100 yards in. Then you're not running from anything. You're just lying on the ground. So we walked fast, in a tight line, Danny in front because he knew the trail best. For maybe 20 minutes that worked. I actually started to think we'd outpaced it, or that it had lost interest, or that it had never been anything but a bear keeping a wide, cautious distance from 4 loud men with flashlights. Then Pete needed to stop. He said it fast, embarrassed, the kind of thing you don't want to admit in front of guys you've known for 6 hours. His stomach had been off since the beans. It wasn't going to wait. Could we just give him 2 minutes off the trail? We said fine. We stood in the rain while he went maybe 20 feet into the tree line. Marcus made a joke about it that I don't remember because none of us really laughed. Then it was quiet. Then it had been quiet a while. Danny called his name. Nothing. We found the spot easily enough. A flattened patch of undergrowth where he'd have crouched, maybe 15 feet off the trail. Marcus's light found it first, and for half a second there was a hand in the beam. Low, close to the ground. Pale in a way skin doesn't usually get. The fingers too long and ending in something that caught the light wrong. Sharp, not round. A little above it, about waist height, 2 points of light flared back at us, the way an animal's eyes do in a headlight. Except animal eyes drop when the head turns. These didn't drop. They just held there, steady, looking straight back down the beam like they'd been waiting for it to land. I don't know which one of us made the sound. I took a step back before I decided to take one. Somebody's hand was shaking. Mine or Marcus's, I still don't know. The beam jumped, and when it settled back on the same spot, there was nothing there but a broken branch, forked at the end, 2 wet knots in the bark catching the light at an angle that could throw back almost anything if you wanted it to. A branch. A branch doesn't have knuckles. I knew that, standing in that clearing, the same as I know it now. I said branch anyway, because Pete was still out there somewhere. Not a lot else at the spot. No sign of a struggle I could point to and say, here, this is where it happened. The ground was mud, and rain had already started smoothing over anything that might have told us a direction. His flashlight, the small one he carried himself, was lying there, on, beam pointed straight up into the canopy, like he'd dropped it and it landed just right. His rifle was there too, leaning against the same tree, safety still on. Finding it leaning there, untouched, told me more than the flashlight did. Flashlights don't land face up. Not once in 50 tries. It landed exactly the way you'd need it to land if you wanted 3 men standing in the rain to look at a little cone of light going nowhere and think, maybe he just dropped it. We called for him for what felt like an hour and was probably 15 minutes. Marcus wanted to spread out and search. Danny said absolutely not. Splitting up now was the single worst thing we could do. I remember agreeing with him so hard it scared me. Some part of my brain had already decided, before I had the words for it, that spreading out was exactly what something out there wanted us to do. We stayed in that clearing, calling Pete's name, until Marcus said he heard him. Off to the north. Faint, but a voice, saying, "Help," or something close enough to it that all three of us turned at once. Danny hesitated. I remember that, him not moving, while Marcus already had. Marcus went fast, into the trees, rifle still slung useless across his back, calling back that he had a visual, that Pete was maybe 50 yards out. Danny screamed at him to stop, to wait. I screamed too. Marcus didn't stop. Then Marcus's light was moving away from us through the trees, at a speed no person moves at when they're picking their way through brush in the dark. Too smooth, too even, like it wasn't being carried by legs at all. Then it just went out. Not moved out of sight, went out, like someone had switched it off. Danny grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise it. I still have the mark, faded now. I have a picture I took of it 2 days later. Then he said the only thing he said the entire rest of the night that I understood as a real plan. We had to get to the truck. Whatever was out there wanted us split up and moving toward it. The only thing left to do was get to the road. I asked what about Marcus? I asked what about Pete? Danny didn't answer me. I've spent 4 years deciding whether that was because he didn't have an answer or because he already knew one and couldn't say it. I've landed on the second one. We ran then. I know I said nobody should run, and I stand by that. We did it anyway, because the alternative had stopped being a choice. Twice I heard my name. Not Pete's voice, not Marcus's. My own name, in a voice that sounded like Danny's, coming from behind us, while Danny was right beside me, gripping my sleeve so hard I couldn't have turned toward it even if I'd wanted to. I didn't turn toward it. That's the one thing in this whole story I got right on instinct. It's the only reason I'm the one telling it, and not someone telling a story about me. The trail dropped down toward the Briar Fork Road. For a while, the ground was too loud with our own footsteps and breathing to hear anything else, and I let myself believe, just for those 2 or 3 minutes, that outrunning it was a thing that could be done. Then Danny went down. Root, maybe. Or the ground just gave under the rain. He went down hard. I stopped and got an arm under him. He was trying to get up, swearing, telling me to go, just go. I didn't listen to that either. I got him up, and we went maybe another 30 feet like that, him limping, me hauling half his weight. That's when I saw it. The only time all night I actually saw it. My hand found the rifle sling before my brain caught up to why. I got it up, stock into my shoulder, safety off, the whole motion pure muscle memory from 20 deer seasons. I fired before I'd really decided to. One shot, center mass, close enough that I know I hit it. I didn't hear the round go off over the rain and my own pulse. What I remember is what didn't happen after. No stagger, no flinch, no sound out of it at all, no shift in its weight, nothing to say a piece of lead had passed through it one way or the other. A deer takes a hit like that and it drops, or it runs. This did neither. It just kept standing there, exactly the way it had been standing there before I pulled the trigger, like the shot had never happened at all. It was standing between 2 trees that weren't quite far enough apart for something that size to fit. Except it fit. The way a shape fits into a gap when the gap is the wrong shape and doesn't matter. Tall. Taller than the low branches around it. Well over anything I'd call a man. Not a man, though. The wrongness of it wasn't in the size. It was in how still it held itself, and then wasn't still at all. Both at once, like watching a video with a bad frame rate. I saw an arm, or the idea of an arm, hanging longer than an arm should hang. I did not see a face. I'm grateful every day of my life that I didn't, because the 2 seconds I looked at where a face should have been are the only part of that night that still gets into my dreams. Just that it was the wrong shape for nothing to be looking back. Danny saw it too. He didn't scream. He made a sound I've never heard a person make before or since. Low, more like something going out of him than something coming out of him. Then he pulled away from me, hard and deliberate, shoving me toward the road. He said, "Run." This time I did, because there was nothing left in me that could argue with it. I don't remember most of the last mile. I remember mud. I remember hitting the Briar Fork Road and how strange the flat, open gravel felt after hours of trees pressing in on every side. I remember the truck, getting the door open, how long it took my hands to manage the key because they wouldn't stop shaking. I remember looking in the mirror as I pulled out and seeing nothing behind me at all. No shape in the road, no eyes catching the taillights, nothing. Just rain and dark and the tree line where I'd left 3 men who were, as far as any search team ever determined, never there at all in any way you could prove. I called it in from the gas station at the bottom of the county road because my hands still weren't steady enough to trust with the truck for another mile. The dispatcher asked me twice to repeat myself, not because the connection was bad, but because I don't think what I was saying made sense to her the first time. Search and rescue had a team up on the ridge by first light. I wasn't allowed to go back in with them. Protocol, they said, and I didn't fight it. I have never in my life wanted to go back to a place less than I wanted to go back to that trail. But I sat in the gravel lot at the trailhead most of that first day, wrapped in a blanket somebody's wife had brought out, and watched them work. I watched the dog handler. There were 2 dogs, cadaver-trained and trail-trained both, the handler told me later. Dogs that had worked worse country than this. Both went fine for the first half mile. Then, right around where the trail forks toward the second creek crossing, they stopped. Not tired stopped. Planted, front feet dug in, the younger one backing up on its own before any command was given. Whining in a register the handler said he'd only heard once before, on a nest of copperheads. He pushed them past that fork 3 times over 2 days. Neither dog would cross it. On the 3rd try, the older one, 6 years on the job, a dog he trusted with his life, bit him. Not hard. A warning, and one it had never given before or since. They stopped bringing the dogs past the fork after that, and searched the rest on foot. The keys to the truck rental turned up at my apartment 2 days later when the sheriff's department came by to ask me to go through the story again. Slower this time, because parts of it, they said, weren't lining up with what they'd found. What they'd found was our campsite, packed up exactly the way we'd have packed it before moving out, which I couldn't explain because we hadn't finished packing it. We'd left in a hurry with half the gear still strung to the tarp poles. Even the rifles were there, 4 of them, cased and stacked neatly against the cooler, which was its own kind of wrong, because I know for a fact we ran with ours. What they'd found was Pete's flashlight, in the clearing, dead, batteries corroded like it had been sitting there through a dozen rainstorms instead of 1 night. What they never found, not in 11 days of search and rescue with dogs and a helicopter with thermal, was Danny, or Marcus, or Pete, or any physical sign that would explain what happened to 3 grown men on a 2-mile stretch of well-mapped county land. The sheriff, an older guy named Holt who'd worked this county his whole career, took my statement without much reaction, until I got to the part about the dry patch in the rain. He stopped writing. He asked me to describe it again. Exactly. When I did, he set his pen down, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "You said that happened up near the Ridge Trail, past the second creek crossing?" I said yes. He nodded slow, like I'd confirmed something he already believed and didn't want to. Then he told me, off the record, not for the file, one person to another, that Barrow Ridge had a reputation going back further than his own time on the job. A missing hiker in 91. Boots found a mile from any trail he could plausibly have walked. Both laces still tied. 2 teenagers in the 70s who came out of those woods after a bad storm and never spoke another word to anyone. Either one of them for the rest of their lives. He said the old families out that way call it the hollow opening. It only ever seems to happen when a hard rain sits on the ridge more than a day. People who've lived out there for generations don't hike Barrow Ridge in November, no matter how good the deer season is, and none of them have ever explained why. He told me this like a man handing something off he'd been carrying too long by himself. Then he told me to go home and not repeat it to anyone, because it wouldn't help the case, and it definitely wouldn't help me. Marcus's phone turned up on day 9, wedged in a rock shelf above the creek, a quarter-mile from anywhere the dogs had shown interest. The battery was long dead, but the department got a tech to pull what was on it. Holt let me sit in a small room at the station and watch the last video Marcus had taken. By then, he'd stopped pretending this was a normal missing persons case and started treating me like the only witness he was ever going to get. 11 seconds. Dark. Shaking. You can hear him breathing hard, saying Pete's name twice. Low, like he's trying not to be heard by anything except Pete. In the last 4 seconds, the phone's own flash catches something at the edge of the frame. A white blur that resolves, once the focus catches up, into a broken branch, forked at the end. The same shape, or close enough to it that I had to leave that room for a minute the first time I watched it. Then, with a full second still left on the clock, the branch moves. Pulls back, out of frame, the way a hand pulls back once it knows it's been seen. The department's official position is that it's a low branch swaying in the wind. There was no wind in Marcus's audio. Holt knew that too. He just never wrote it down. I moved out of Hollow County 8 months later. I tell people it was for work. I did get a job 2 hours south. The real reason is I couldn't keep answering when people who knew Danny, or Marcus, or Pete's ex-wife asked me, gently, if I was sure I remembered it right. I still hear it sometimes. Not often. 4 or 5 times a year. Always late. Always when it's raining hard enough to fill up a room. Not close. Not even clearly outside. It's Danny's voice, saying my name. I lie there in the dark. I do not get up. I do not go to the window, and I do not turn toward it.